Snowflake, he thinks. It lands on his forehead, all but imperceptible, a sacrificial first that allows its brethren to start falling. Cold, the young man thinks. Cold pinpricks of sensation across his face, a face that moments before felt... what? He can't remember. He knows he is in a strange new world. Its strangeness he knows by contrast, but what came before he can't seem to recall. Not this. A neutral input in all five senses, and yet a thrumming in his mind and a sickness in his gut. Naked. He knows he is naked and cold, a stranger in a strange land. Names and nouns and vowels float through his head. My name, her name, that other name. He is driven by a purpose so climactic that no one in this world of snow could understand, and yet he cannot seem to latch onto the full significance of his mission. He can't seem to recall any details. No, he can't remember the broader strokes at all. The young man struggles to move, every minute function of his body slowed to a painful crawl by the biting cold. He knows cold. He has experienced cold. Worse cold than this. But never without the bare minimum protection of clothing. Never without the bare minimum comprehension of a working memory. How far had he walked? 10 meters? 100 miles? What incomprehensible journey could have led him to such a strange and unfeeling world? Had he chosen to come here? Or had he been predestined from long ago, taken his first stumbling steps onto a journey that would last decades up until this very moment, this old yet new world? That was the path he traveled, the man realizes, the memories slipping through his fingers as he tries desperately to make them stay. He walked from the new into the old, from the old into the older. He is a lone wanderer, forsaken by time and the gods. There will be no safety for him here, he realizes. No comfort. The old rises up before him as he chokes back tears, the journey of all these long years finally seeming to near its end as the ageless rhizome just barely begins to untangle itself. He steps from the new into the old, future to past, as the great dark structures rise around him, the great black looking glass reflecting the artificial sky. These monoliths of a world long gone seem so much bigger than before, so much more imposing than when he was young. He used to have hope and confidence and the fires of youth and love burning in his heart. Now he has nothing. Nothing but memories. Concrete memories, but memories nonetheless. He stumbles forward and steadies himself on the side of a building as it moves away. He shouldn't be here yet, he knows. They told him it wasn't time, but he couldn't hold off any longer. Not after all these years. The buildings grow higher around him, blocking out the night sky, though he can no longer tell where the clouds end and the unknowable vastness of creation begins. The years have not been kind. The old man leans on the building as it grows steadier, firmer. He watches its neighbors grow higher into the sterile atmosphere, and before long, everything seems to grow still. The sound of voices echoes from somewhere nearby. The sound of youth. Of hope. Steadying himself on his own 2 feet, the old man begins making his way towards the reunion. Matty 1. Manure. That was the smell that had invaded his sinuses, activating his gag reflex and forcing him out of a deep, if uncomfortable, sleep. Waking up in an unknown place, sounds and smells hitting like a brick wall, hair and clothes plastered to his body with sweat, this wasn't new for Matty, but nothing that he registered through his 3 active senses indicated familiarity, let alone safety. He needed to know he wasn't in danger and that he still had his wallet. After that, he could figure out where he was and whether his last explicit memory was recorded a concerningly long time ago. Matty struggled to sit up, his eyes squinting against the daytime glare. He could hear the noises of a city, people talking and what sounded like livestock being driven, but he didn't have the vaguest idea where he was. The hard, gritty surface beneath him didn't feel like anything civilized, and the warm air didn't smell like Hanover. It smelled like manure. As Matty opened his eyes by degrees, he felt something hard behind his back and leaned on it for support, a wall of some kind. Big, uneven stone bricks, definitely not a building. His first thought was that, somehow, he had made it to Mexico and been stopped on his way in, probably thrown out on his ass by some Border Patrol agents who had grown tired of his incontinent musings on the arbitrary nature of international boundaries. It seemed like a valid theory until he remembered that the hypothetical border wall, such a beloved talking point among a certain demographic of American voters, was still very much hypothetical. He took the plunge and looked up, sunlight and dust burning his eyes. But all the scenery did was confirm that he was very far from New Hampshire. He caught a hint of granite peeking into the blue sky, maybe some marble behind that, but nothing looked remotely familiar, not incidentally or in general style. His closest guess was Boston, but even the pre-industrial buildings hoarded by New England historical societies didn't look quite as elegant or quite as ancient as the corners and edges he could just barely make out. From his place leaning against the wall, Matty could see a crowd of people moving this way and that, some holding baskets, others driving cattle, some occasionally coming in or out of the simple buildings across from him. They were dressed in a style he had never seen in the modern world. Simple, loose, like the kind of clothes a vagrant would wear after losing his last pair of jeans. But these weren't rough potato sacks or cut-up trash bags. Their clothes were light, clean, almost expensive looking by the assumed standards of their environment. As the cloud of sleep drifted from his eyes and the mounting headache threatened to blind him all over again, Matty forced his eyes to do their God-given task and squinted past the shuffling crowd of humans and animals, focusing on the pair of high-rising corner walls he'd first laid eyes on. They were far away, he realized only now, far off and very tall, or else a little closer and a little shorter, and maybe it was the hangover, but he thought it was possible that the city was very confusing. If this even was a city. The buildings across the dirt road were blocky, whitewashed, with red slate roofs and hardly a second story to be found. Matty realized he'd been holding his breath and let it out, leaning his head back against the wall and closing his eyes. The rough stone dug into his scalp. "Where the hell am I?" he muttered through a mouth of cotton. It was a third world country. He was pretty sure of that. There was no city in the United States or its immediate neighbors that looked like this. Maybe those short, temporary-looking buildings could have been at home in some remote part of Mexico or northern South America, but the people in their dirty, off-white tunics, with their baskets and their lowing cattle, they were too European-looking to be Central American, and when Matty was able to catch an individual word through the collective voices, he was pretty sure it wasn't Spanish. The rocky path that had served as Matty's bed didn't look like any pictures he had ever seen of Africa, the Middle East, definitely not East Asia, and not Australia either. Matty wasn't convinced that Australia even existed, but he knew if it did, it didn't look like this. How much longer, Matty thought to himself, was he going to sit here and draw further into contemplation of his own ignorance before he actually got up and figured out what was going on? Well, he did have some idea what was going on. A dense ball of pain was growing in his frontal lobe, the kind that came from too much drinking, not too much thinking. It was a sensation he knew well. But what kind of debaucherous night could land him stuck in a third world country, hundreds if not thousands of miles from home? Well, the kind of night that led to another of its kind, then another, and another, until the drunken stupor lasted long enough to be classified as a bender. Was that what this was? The end result of a week or two of overindulgence? If so, had he been drinking for celebratory reasons or depressive ones? Before he could think of a reason not to, Matty opened his eyes and pulled himself up, his fingers finding shallow holds in the rocky wall behind him. "Okay," he grunted. "I'm up." He looked around. The scene wasn't much different from 6 feet up. He stood by a tall stone barrier, probably 30 feet high, and his dirt path bordered a row of the plaster buildings. Behind and between them, shadowy side streets of cobblestone and more one-story structures. And on the path, always in flux, was the crowd of women in gowns and men in mini-dresses. As he watched them, Matty realized they were watching back. A lot of them were staring at him without breaking stride, absently whipping their cows or clutching their baskets, while their eyes focused on the dark-haired man in the strange clothes. Matty was wearing jeans, a black button-up, and a gray sports coat, his usual outfit for a day in the classroom, but apparently an unusual sight in this foreign land. "What?" he said aloud to no one in particular. The closest among the crowd were always giving him a strange look and seemed to trade the expression off as they moved along. He realized that his throat was dry, his mouth sour, clear signs of late-night drinking. He tried again. "Habla español?" He didn't speak 3 words of Spanish, but Spain was the country that came to mind when he saw those smooth white buildings and those swarthy people in their strange clothes. Spain, or maybe Greece. He'd seen enough dream vacation photos to have a general idea. He frowned. No, he realized he wasn't reminded of Greece. It was Rome. Ancient Rome, to be exact, though to someone who didn't care, there wasn't much difference. Except even Maddie could tell their clothes were wrong. Italy wasn't a third world country, and he was pretty sure they'd discovered pants by now. The country that had given birth to pizza and fascism didn't subsist on driving cattle. Not in the 21st century. Maddie wandered into the crowd, bracing himself against the push of people and animals. He had been to New York, he knew how to make his way through big groups on the street, but this was a little different. These people weren't on their way to catch the subway or hit the bodega before their lunch break ended. They didn't seem quite so rushed. Their movements were calm, less paranoid than he had seen in any American city. This, if nothing else, told Maddie he was in a third world country. "Excuse me," he said to the woman walking closest to him. He was following the bulk of the crowd, moving down the gritty road and past the whitewashed houses. "What country is this?" He had to raise his voice over the mooing of cattle and the clucking of chickens and the conversations held in a foreign language. He might have been able to recognize the dialect if the peasants weren't all talking over each other. The woman didn't respond, though she'd obviously heard. She was around his age, he thought, with dark hair piled on top of her head in a style he wasn't used to seeing on white women. She wore a loose off-white gown, sleeveless, cinched at the waist with a cord. Probably cotton, not particularly nice-looking, regardless of national origin. "Yeah," said that nagging voice in the back of his misty mind. She was just like whatever disparate images of ancient Roman women he had seen. Weird. Maybe it was a reenactment. "I just woke up here," he continued. The woman didn't even dignify him with a glance, but he could tell she had heard. God, he was thirsty. "This isn't America, right?" Still, nothing. Maddie decided to call it a day, not to give up, but to accept the outcome. Language was his profession. He made a living teaching students how to better utilize English. He wouldn't be caught dead playing into the trope of the uneducated American yelling monosyllables at foreigners in a desperate attempt to turn them bilingual. So he followed the crowd, keeping pace with the dark-haired woman. She eventually turned onto one of the side streets, and they left the border wall, the sandy road giving way to flat and even flagstones. This, at least, reminded him of New England, if the buildings on either side were still completely foreign. The alleyway, if that's what this stone path was, led under a massive arch of brick, so deep that it was more like a tunnel, more grand than an overpass, and apparently holding up a tall building dotted with windows. If this was a third world country, Maddie thought, it was one that used to be wealthy enough to build this impressive city, or else these swarthy people in their dirty tunics had moved in after the original builders were wiped out. As the blue sky disappeared behind the tall arched overpass, Maddie swallowed back the notion that had been forming in his hungover mind. It was stupid, he thought, and not even worth thinking about. Maybe this strange city did look more like a wealthy country in the ancient world than a poor country in the 21st century, but unless Jack Daniels had recently added an ingredient that could cause temporal warping while intoxicated, that wasn't a line of thought he needed to follow. Maddie followed the woman out the other side of the tunnel and found himself in an open area, a loose courtyard enclosed by tall wooden buildings. They were surrounded by vendors, small booths and tents manned by people hawking their livestock, produce, and clothing. The air was full of sounds and smells, yelling, clucking, and, still, manure. It reminded him of the weekly immigrant-led market in the North End. Maddie felt his stomach twist. He might have to revisit the reenactment theory, he thought, because God damn, the chaos around him, the shouts of sellers and squeals of buyers, the clip-clop of cow hooves and the bok-bok of chickens in wooden cages, the crowded market square below to the deep blue sky above. He didn't know the how, but he knew the what. The what was ancient Rome, though conversely this in no way proved the when or the where. The where couldn't be Rome, not really, not unless he'd flown across the world while blacked out. And the when, well, ancient wasn't the answer. Ancient couldn't be the answer, not as long as words still had meaning and time still moved in one direction. Reenactment, he reminded himself. The only logical explanation. If he could accept that he had somehow ended up in Europe, he could believe that this was some kind of citywide event for the anniversary of something or something else. Maybe it was Christmas. Or Saturnalia. With a start, he realized the woman had almost disappeared into the crowd of shoppers. He hurried after her, keeping close but hanging back. Whoever she was his anchor to reality, and he didn't need her running away. Someone bumped into him from behind and shot Maddie a weird look, probably the clothes, before moving on. Maddie scanned the crowd, looking for the woman he had followed, and froze. She was standing across the courtyard, speaking to a pair of imposing-looking men and pointing through the crowd at Maddie. She had ignored him, but had she actually been scared? Or was it because of his clothes? Maybe it was a faux pas to break the reenactment. Maybe the Italians were psychotically attached to their historical LARPing. The two men, cops, started towards him, and every muscle in Maddie's body tensed up. Should he run? What would happen if these make-believe authority figures caught him? He knew what the back of a squad car felt like, but somehow he didn't think they had one of those. The men wove their way through the crowd, dodging women holding baskets and men trying to intercept them with merchandise. Maddie's pulse quickened. Run or no? They were 30 feet away, then 20. God damn it, he hissed, turning and plunging into the crowd. In his experience, no matter what the situation or the time period, cops storming towards him never spelled anything good for the near future. Behind him, the men cried out, and he could hear them start to run. Maddie pushed through the crowd, shoving aside women in shawls, not taking the time to apologize or to marvel at the thoroughness of their reproduction. If he wasn't smart, if he wasn't logical, if he wasn't a professor, for God's sake, he might have been tempted to think that this level of historical reproduction was hardly more believable than traveling back in time. Maddie escaped the marketplace through an alley, trying to move fast without bumping into pedestrians or tripping on the discarded objects littering the street. A quick glance behind him revealed the two men careening out of the market, faces drawn in fury as they shoved aside the civilians. Maddie moved ahead, leaving the alley and taking to the street. He didn't admire the scenery as he ran, and he didn't think about the situation. He couldn't let himself wonder or theorize, or he would lose his resolve and get caught. All that went through his mind was the pain growing in his side and the headache threatening to split his skull. Behind him, he could hear the shouts and footsteps of his pursuers. He realized too late that he had left the beaten path, as it were. The wide street gave way to a casual walking trail, smooth slate tiles cutting across a well-manicured lawn. By the time he realized he was running uphill, it was too late to turn back. The pain raked at his side, and he allowed himself a moment of power walking to conserve energy. Up ahead, on the plateaus of the rolling green hill, a number of houses loomed over their lesser neighbors, blocky and white, but clearly expensive, lavish in an ancient sort of way, with courtyards and pools and subsidiary structures. A glance behind told Maddie that the two men were still following, even gaining on him, so he grasped his ribcage with both hands and left the footpath, pushing himself harder than he had since 8th grade PE as he stumbled across the grass, ascending ever higher towards the white houses. Maddie's lungs were burning, but he still heard the men behind him, their near-silent feet in the grass drowned out by their occasional shouted orders. They were trained soldiers, he thought. Of course they would have better stamina than him. Or, he corrected himself, whoever was in charge of this whole facade had chosen athletic men to portray the authority figures. Maybe outside the play acting, they were actually in the military. Up ahead, the grass seemed to give way to open air as the hill sloped down. The sky was growing cloudy, and the world beyond the hill looked purely white, like a blank sheet of paper. He pushed on, his legs and skull protesting the effort, lying to himself, forcing the idea that if he could make it to the summit, he could disappear and find the freedom to assess the situation. Maddie did make it to the summit, and he did stop running, but the sight that lay before him wasn't the salvation he'd promised himself. All thoughts of his hangover, the pursuing men, and the imaginary reenactment vanished from his mind as he looked out across a landscape that anyone with a decent education would recognize on sight. A handful of expensive white homes descended below him to the base of the hill, but down at ground level, the houses were ugly, improvised structures, wood and brick rising up to 6 stories in dangerous-looking towers. In all directions, this hill acting as the spoke of Maddie's vision of what seemed to be all of creation, the buildings of dark or light material, of expensive or shoddy construction, spiraled out in ragged lines, crisscrossing and intertwining until they were indistinguishable apart from the occasional palace-sized home. Laid out below him were hundreds, thousands of buildings, a genuine city, but none could be called skyscrapers, and none had been made by modern machinery. The buildings were white, their roofs were red, the crowds were dense, and the air was polluted, not with fossil fuel remnant, but with the all-natural scents and smells of an ancient city. The collection of miniature homes laid out below him like a city of dolls seemed to stretch to infinity, ad infinitum. A circle of forested hills standing in the way of anyone who wished to harm this cradle of the gods. And right in Maddie's line of sight, hundreds of feet below and hardly a quarter-mile away, was a building even more recognizable than the city itself, a simple cylinder known across the world more for its missing pieces than the parts that had remained. The Colosseum was now fully formed, and less imposing from this height, but its presence was the straw that broke the camel's back, the sight that finally jolted Maddie out of his self-delusion. The Colosseum still existed in the 21st century, but not with that extra quarter of its bulk. Maddie felt a far-off pop as his knees hit the grassy earth. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be. Pale white ghosts loomed in every archway of the amphitheater, mocking him, drawing him back to a present that was the past. Footsteps came to a stop behind him, and one of the soldiers barked a command. He said it again and again until Maddie's muddled brain finally acknowledged the language. Maddie obliged, slowly, tearing his eyes away from the city laid out below him and looking over his shoulder to see the two men he now realized weren't reenactors, weren't from an Italy of mozzarella and organized crime. These men were sworn agents of the Roman Empire. "What the hell's going on?" Maddie said, as one of the men stepped up to him and raised a dagger.